Good morning, Emily.
Good morning, Dr. Dan.
Are we still doing that?
If only because it's in the script.
Well, you've got me there. So, what are we talking about today?
Merging finances with a partner or spouse, making career decisions within a relationship, and splitting finances up.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, we're doing the whole all marriages end in death or divorce life cycle here. That'll be fun.
Well, sure, I'm a little biased though, but we won't get into that.
That's fair. You and I do represent technically both ends of that continuum. All right, well, talk to me. What do we want to talk about on the merging finances front?
All right, so just first of all, we'll start with overall advice kind of. People that are in a relationship of sorts where they're combined. Should they have one joint account, separate account, some sort of hybrid situation? I mean, what's kind of the ideal situation there?
The ideal situation is whatever keeps you from fighting and what also protects you from irresponsible financial decisions on the part of your partner. So, there's a big thing that a lot of divorce is caused by financial issues, and there's even a term for financial infidelity, right? Spending money that you're not supposed to or not allowed to, or that your partner hasn't agreed to. But on the other side of that, the big thing is just ultimately that you really want to make sure your money is managed in a way where you're both comfortable with it and can both be agreeable without it, and in a way that still mutually benefits the accomplishment of your shared financial goals.
Okay. So it's pretty personal, but how do you reach that agreement? What if you and your partner just cannot agree on one version of this?
The problem with that is that you are going to end up with a system, whether you agree on a system or not, right? So if one of you, let's say, is a diehard, we should share everything type, and the other person is a diehard, my money is my money type, what you're going to end up with is a joint account that one of you funds and an individual account that the other one doesn't, and you're going to end up with very consistent financial strife. Now, avoidance is sometimes behavior. You see that some couples will just not talk about money. You make money, I make money. As long as our bills are paid, we just don't talk about it, and that can work. I'll look at even my parents as a good example of this. I think, at least by their disclosure to me or their explanation to me, they really never spent a great deal of time talking about money or discussing money, and they kind of went the shared route in a lot of ways. But that works for some people, and that wouldn't work for others. The big issue with that sort of lack of agreement is then that you may have a disproportionate kind of burden of who's doing the financial responsible things, right? One of you might be funding your 401k, one of you might not be, one of you might be paying down a lot of debt, one of you might be spending all their money on frivolous stuff. Like, an agreement is really important to reach, and so it has to be a system that you can both live with, understanding that you might both have very valid goals and objectives and reasons why you want to keep things separate or why you want to share things, or vice versa, that you might have real life experiences and concerns and valid kind of fears about misuse or abuse by your partner in a financial sense.
Sure. So maybe communicating early on is better than letting it sit though, regardless of how you end up deciding.
What a lot of couples do is they sort of default to whatever their system was when they got together. And that's an interesting thing because is the way that you manage your finances with your boyfriend or your girlfriend the right way for a married couple with children and so on to manage their finances, right? Like, it's not uncommon, let's say, if you have wildly different earnings, maybe one of you is an engineer, one of you is a teacher, that the teacher is kind of just getting by paycheck to paycheck, and they're funding para, and maybe they're putting a little bit into a 403b or 401k or something, and otherwise they're not really building a lot of savings, and that the engineer is maxing out their 401k, maxing out a Roth IRA, they got equity options and all of this. And so not only can their savings and financial management be different or dictated simply by differences in income, but also you can really run into a very real issue in which this also then really impacts how your financial futures would develop, right? If one of you is maxing your retirement, one of you is not. One of you is used to living paycheck to paycheck, one of you is not. The problem is that keeping up with the Joneses can be something that happens inside the house, where one partner has the financial means to sort of spend money, not frivolously, but at will, and one doesn't. And the one who can't then can end up in a situation where either they overspend to keep up with their partner, or you reach this uncomfortable sort of like, you need to subsidize me type of dynamic. And I'm not saying that one is necessarily right or wrong, but it's an element where, again, a deliberate approach to your finances is going to be much more constructive than just sort of doing whatever you did at the outset. We'll just split things 50-50 or something like that. And then just sort of letting that meander into the rest of your relationship.
Sure. Yeah, I guess letting it sit certainly doesn't help. I know someone in my personal life mentioned a few months ago that she had just kind of gotten to a good point with her savings and she felt like she had an emergency fund, and then her partner planned a trip with their family and they were expected to go with. And she was like, I feel like I have to go on this trip that's been planned and I'm expected to, but I don't really have the money for it. And it kind of was a little hiccup there for her. I think it ended up fine, but certainly I think something should have talked about in advance, maybe instead of after the tickets were bought.
That's really where you run into an issue as well, where, what is the threshold of discuss before purchasing in your relationship? And you can set it as a percentage, you can set it as a dollar amount, you can just decide that certain subjects like trips or travel that maybe incur lots of secondary costs are always something that warrant a discussion, or something like that. But it's interesting because a lot of that often kind of gets put into what we'd call a one-off bucket. Like, oh, we're not going to stress over travel stuff because we only take like 1 or 2 trips a year anyway. Well, okay, maybe you only plan to take 1 or 2 trips a year. What happens when there's a funeral? What happens when there's a wedding? What happens when you're the best man or the maid of honor and suddenly you're expected to pay a lot more to support sort of the nuptials of your friends or your family member? So it's easy to sort of have that plan at face value and it's only stuff we're in control of. But what happens when those external factors come in? What is your system for evaluating those costs and expenses? Or for that matter, what if it's a known problem, right? What if one of you comes in with a lot of debt because maybe they had student loans or credit cards, or a big life event happen that really cost them quite a bit? One of you comes in with no debt. Should the new partner be helping pay off the other partner's debt? Or is there some element of, what's yours is yours and what's mine is mine, both on the positives and the negatives? So that it really does come down to having a serious conversation about what your household financial strategy is and what your reasonable degrees of commitment are and what your systems are for dealing with those one-offs, so that they are not always being kind of chosen or decided upon in isolation, but that there's a consistent system for evaluating how you address those.
Sure, that makes sense. I want to talk a little bit about assets that you have before you got married. Let's say we're talking legal marriage now at this point, not just moving in together. How do you address things like that? Like if you have 401k that you've been contributing to maybe quite well throughout your life, but then you get married.
So functionally, and this is going to vary state by state, whether you're in a community property state or not, and so on, but functionally, anything you come into the marriage with is separate property. Anything you inherit during the marriage is separate property. Like there's certain things that are carved out of the marriage. But the challenge is that it's sort of a one drop in the water spoils the whole thing issue, which is, if you bring your, let's say, $100,000 401k that you built up over the last 5 years, and you were contributing to it, and then you get married, and then you keep contributing to the same 401k, it's now very difficult to separate the marital versus non-marital property there. You could then, in the event of like a separation in the future or something, try to argue like, look, the balance as of the day we got married was $100,000. So at the very least, I should be able to take my $100,000 out in the event of a divorce and not have that be considered part of the marriage. But commingling of assets, having shared bank accounts, shared savings accounts, taking, let's say, an inherited investment account and just combining it with your existing joint brokerage or even your individual brokerage that has had money put into it from your job while you were working, any of those sorts of things cause commingling to happen. So if you do have separate property that was there before the marriage, whether it was yours, inherited, whatever the case is, or during a marriage, you want to take really strong care to genuinely keep that property separate and uncommingled from other financial assets. So that can mean that you end up with extra brokerage accounts, extra bank accounts, and so on. But it's very important that you do that, because if you're trying to preserve the value of your assets with just keeping in mind that not all marriages do work out, then you have to really do the work and perform the ongoing effort to keep those things separate. For example, my wife and I both have Roth IRAs, and they're literally labeled premarital Roth IRA, and no money goes into them anymore. And we have postmarital Roth IRAs that we actively fund. And so if we ever do go our separate ways, at least those premarital Roth IRAs are held separately and will go back to us respectively and not have an issue of commingling.
That makes sense. Is that the only way to go about it? Can you just do a prenup, for example, and say, whatever I had when I came into this is mine, blah, 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 and that's enough? Or you should still do separate accounts like that?
Well, prenup actually is not required for that necessarily because, again, you have separate property when you get married, and then property becomes marital property, earnings become marital property as you are in your relationship. And again, the exact definitions and guidelines here are going to vary state by state. If you really want a super clear and specific answer for you personally, go talk to a family law attorney. But a prenup is not necessarily required for that. But let's say you own a business or something that is, ostensibly separately owned, but then it's going to be your source of income. It's going to be, a thing that grows in value, that appreciates, that you reinvest in, so on and so forth. That often can become marital property simply because it was sort of unavoidable. And that sort of asset is where a prenup is really helpful.
So, like you as the owner of this practice, for example, it would make sense to have one just to make it simpler.
Yeah. And actually, that's a perfect example. My wife and I have a prenup. The practice is essentially the whole thing. I own a business. She owns a business. We both agreed that, if we ever do separate, the businesses are carved out as separate property, even though there's, income and so on that reinvests and comes from this. Just that, something like taking a multi-million-dollar financial planning practice and having to buy somebody out of it is problematic in an extreme sense that really just doesn't make any sense from a practical standpoint. And so we just made the agreement and the decision that was something we separated. But everything else, again, premarital Roth, postmarital Roth, and so on, like we had a 401k here, that's now marital property because I couldn't shut it off and separate it. And fine, that's a risk that I take. And she took the same risk having her own 401k through her job. Like that's a reasonable set of concessions to make where we don't need to really fight and nickel and dime over every exact thing coming into the marriage, but just recognizing that certain things are problematic to divide up if the marriage fails that may have been accrued during the marriage that you want to kind of pre-negotiate before you cross that line.
Yeah, I kind of wish I'd done some of that when I was married.
Well, I mean, you have a personal experience here. Do you want to talk about what your kind of money management system was with your ex?
Yeah, we sure can. We were definitely younger and less experienced and knowledgeable at the time, so we leaned towards the it's half and half, it's all together, we're never going to split up, we're very sure that this is going to work. Of course, we've been together for like 8 years, so you're feeling confident. He leaned towards the money avoidance part, definitely. He just didn't like talking about it as much, and I didn't push the issue. But then, our lives grew and progressed because, like you said, we were younger, we got together, we didn't have enough to fight over, so it didn't matter when we got married. We didn't feel like we needed a prenup, so we didn't have one. But then we bought a business together and, put a lot of our time and energy and assets and money into that business, and that was kind of our baby. So then when we separated, that was complicated because there was no way to divide it up fairly without, screwing each other over in a big way or, destroying the business in the process. And it got very complicated to divide up and left one of us getting more than the other, definitely. I don't think it was quite fair because there was no way to do it fairly.
Yeah. And I mean, that's kind of the challenge, right? If you'd had the framework or had the understanding going into it, you could have renegotiated those things, right? But functionally, what happens in the course of the marriage is functionally a shared decision, even if one of you makes it unilaterally. This is also where you run into like the horror stories of people where one spouse just racks up credit card debt or takes a loan out against the value of the house and then wastes all the money or gambles your savings away. Like there's real issues that can occur there. We've done a fair bit of divorce work in the practice, and it's funny because there was a client from a number of years ago where essentially their spouse was the director of finance for a Fortune 500 company, so ostensibly somebody who was very good with money, and he was terrible with money. Like he wasted essentially everything he earned. He didn't save, he didn't invest, none of it, and the partner eventually ended up divorcing him because he was so bad with money. And it's something where you might assume that your partner is going to be on the same page as you, but at the end of the day, you kind of have to take a step back and assume nothing. And again, deliberate, thoughtful, slow conversations really make a difference here.
Yeah, I would agree, especially after my experiences. My previous partner was a very intelligent person, like IQ wise, they were very smart, and they just didn't want to think about money, so they didn't. And it would have been a lot easier if we had conversations in the beginning and then also as life changed and things came up, like, hey, do we need to revisit this, instead of just sticking to what worked in the early days, because it certainly didn't eventually.
And that's something that not a lot of people are aware of. You can have a marital contract that is post marriage, where you can simply sit down and sort of renegotiate the terms of your marriage. And ideally, with legal counsel, you can actually draft something that is essentially a prenup that you have established in the course of your marriage. So it's not a, oh, I didn't do it, so I guess there's nothing I can do about a situation. Like if you have these concerns, or if circumstances have changed in a certain way where things feel a little bit imbalanced or unfair, it's something that you can address either informally together, again, good, slow, deliberate conversations, or more formally with the help of legal counsel.
Yeah. Yeah, because what about other changes in life? We're talking about some of the obvious ones, but sometimes things will change where you're both W-2 employees, you've got work, you're in your careers, and maybe something changes for one of you, and now they're 1099, they're a contractor, which has tons of implications. Do we need to have a new conversation then at that point as a household?
Well, I think that's a really important one, because the general assumption for a lot of people is that status quo is going to maintain unless they've already discussed it. So, if you have a job somewhere and I marry you or I get together with you, unless you've been telling me about your ambitions to like open that bakery or something, I probably am going to operate under some version of an assumption that you're going to stick with what you were already doing, or that you're going to stay in that same career field or industry. Financial planners sort of have an interesting lens into this, because the majority of financial planners are career changers. They were teachers or engineers or doctors or something else before, and then they became financial planners. Now it's becoming more common that people go to school for it, but that's a separate topic. And so in that context, it's very common that a lot of people attribute their success as financial planners to having a spouse who supported them, right? So they were an engineer previously and they weren't happy doing it, but they really were interested in finance. And they, go to their spouse and say, I want to start a financial planning practice, or I want to get into financial planning. And from everything I've read and seen, it's really hard. It takes years. It's a high failure rate. But if you can earn the stable income in our household and support me in doing this, I think it'll pay off. And that's a conversation that you can evolve into. Same thing for opening that bakery or going back to school to change careers, whatever it is. There's a lot of changes where at the end of the day, status quo is, valuable, but it's very uncommon for people to stay in the same thing that they were doing when they were 22 all the way until they're in their 60s. Career changes, life changes, taking a career break to be a stay-at-home parent or taking a sabbatical, all sorts of stuff happen, and that really complicates the financial life of your partner if it's not sort of planned for and addressed.
Right. Because if let's say we're looking at the 1099 option again, then that person is theoretically most likely not getting a match to retirement accounts and their contributions. And they likely don't have any benefits through work. So then you have to add them to yours, which increases your cost. Do you recommend that partner who switched to 1099 has to kind of compensate the other partner in some way, or it just really, really depends on what they agree on?
It depends on what they agree on, but let's just address like the base facts that matter. Let's say you had a W-2 job paying $100,000 before, and you switched to being a 1099 contractor. Right out of the gate, taking no other, ceteris paribus, right, all things being equal, right out of the gate, you are going to be $7,650 poorer being a 1099, because you have to pay the other half of your payroll tax. Right out of the gate, we're poorer. Now, the argument then would be, well, but then you can expense stuff and you can write stuff off. Well, pause for a second. Previously, you were a W-2 employee, and all this stuff you might be expensing and writing off was presumably being paid for by your company. So yes, you might be able to deduct more income based on your business expenses and so on, but that's coming out of your pocket. And if your income doesn't change to offset that, that's a problem. What I often advise clients on when they say like, oh, I'm thinking about a new position, but it'd be 1099 instead of W-2 is, well, that's great. I think you need at least a 30% premium over what you're currently earning for that to make sense. And if it's not going to make that kind of sense, if you're not going to go from 100 to, let's say, 130, then we have to think really hard about the quality of life or the other soft benefits to making that change. Because what you're doing functionally when you become a 1099 is you're becoming a business owner. So now we need to deal with entity things, legal things, liability, insurance. We have health insurance costs, 401k contributions that we're not getting a match for, higher payroll taxes. Like all of that comes in. So it's not so easy to just say, oh, if you're self-employed, you can write some stuff off and your tax will be lower. Like, no, being self-employed is more expensive in every possible way unless you have the revenue, not the income, the revenue to spend on all those other expenses. And so if it's just a, hey, why don't we switch you from being a W-2 to being a 1099 because reasons, you've got to have a serious change in income for that to actually make sense.
Right. And then you, as you touched on there, retirement savings accounts, like you either need to open one for yourself then as a self-employed person or over contribute to your partners and just view it as a household thing, right?
And that's a really, really big advantage that can come with that. I'll think of a particular client couple. One owns I'm just going to be general here, a business in sort of construction, but also has a W-2 job at the same time. The other one is a pure W-2 employee. And the benefit of that business portion is that they make enough money every single year that the business can max out a retirement account. The owner of the business working in their W-2 job on the other side can also max out the retirement plan through that company. And then they make so much money as a couple that then they can also afford to max out two retirement plans for the pure W-2 spouse because they have access to both a 457 plan and a 401k plan. So altogether combined, they can put essentially over $100,000 into retirement plans as a household. But if it came down solely to their individual earnings and saying like, oh, what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, anything we say, anything we do has to be just on our own, the pure W-2 spouse who has the two retirement plans available couldn't afford to fund both of those retirement plans entirely. It would eat up too much of their paycheck. But because the other spouse can subsidize, it actually ends up being a very tax effective strategy for them.
Right. So they've thought it out, talked it out, they've agreed on it. I hate to bring it up, but then what if they go their separate ways? How does that affect this whole perfectly structured plan that they have?
Well, at that point, that plan doesn't matter so much, right? We have to remember that taxes are handled at a household level. So while we're together, we want to have the most tax efficient, tax effective plan we can as a couple. This gets back into our earlier conversation about having these deliberate, slow, thoughtful conversations about finances and sharing finances. But if we go our separate ways, we're shrinking from a household of two to a household of one from a tax standpoint, and now we just need to do financial planning and tax planning based on our individual needs going forward. So while it makes sense for spouse B in the prior example to max fund two retirement plans to the tune of call it $47,000 a year, they can't afford to do that if they were just single and on their own, but they also don't need to do that if they're single and on their own because their retirement savings need and the lifestyle they afford or could want to fund individually is lesser than the shared lifestyle that they had as a unified household.
Right. So it's a matter of starting all over if you do separate that and making a brand new plan from scratch and not trying to kind of drag pieces of the old one forward with you.
Yeah, I mean it's a new place of where we are today, and probably if you are separating, if you're getting divorced, your vision for the future has probably changed, or at least you no longer have the shared elements of that vision of the future, and so all the planning assumptions about point A and point B have changed. We are in a different place today, and where we're going is probably a different place as well.
Sure. Okay, so when we're talking about the divorce process then and dividing things up, as long as we're on this, how do you try to divide that up as someone who may not know the tax implications of things? For example, like, say we have a house that's only worth 200,000 and we have a retirement account with 200,000. I'll take one, you take the other, and it's fair, right? Let's just go our separate ways.
Oof. Oh man, this is a big topic here. So first and foremost, let's just lay the foundation before we even get into the numbers of your example. Divorce is a wealth destroying activity. The participants in this process, spouse A, spouse B, are never going to walk away from a divorce with 100% of what they started with. They're going to walk away with, let's say, at best 49-49 or 45-45 or 40-40, right? But we are going to destroy wealth. We're going to have to engage professionals who cost real money. We are going to, debate, hem, haw, pay fees, pay for mediation. We're going to have to pay for appraisals. We're going to have to pay for all sorts of things, right? So we're going to destroy wealth by separating. That is just, the advantages of having a partner is that you share expenses. The cost of having a partner is that if you ever go your separate ways, it costs money to unwind it because your household, if we just pretend, for example, that you had 100% and 100% and combined your 200%, your costs as a household might be, let's say, 150%. So more than what either of you could individually support, but together you share it. And when you divide that up, there's going to be some ramifications to that. So take an example like you gave, 200,000 in a retirement account, 200,000 in a house or equity at home. There's a bunch of factors that go into that. Retirement plan. Is this a 401k? Is it pre-tax? Is it Roth? Is it a division of both? Is it all of one or the other? Okay, in that particular case, if it's Roth, it's worth more than the house. If it's pre-tax, it's worth less than the house, the equity in the house. But then let's even just say it's taxable, it's not retirement. Then it's a question of cost basis and holding period. Is it a bunch of short term gains, long term gains? How much of the equity is growth versus how much of it is principal? Compare it to the house. Okay, the house, we have $200,000 of equity, but do we have a beautiful, wonderful 2020, 3% mortgage on it? Or do we have a current 6.5, 7% mortgage? Okay, big difference, because then it's also a question of cash flow. How much can you afford to pay on the mortgage? Can you afford this house on your own? So yeah, when it comes to divorce financial math, and again, I used to be a certified divorce financial analyst. I dropped the designation a while ago, but I still have the education and the knowledge, the experience from it. There's no 50-50 equation where if your balance sheet looks like it's 50-50 on paper, unless all the assets on both sides of that balance sheet are equal in characteristics from tax considerations, cost basis, etc., it is not actually 50-50, even if the numbers at the bottom of the page are equal.
So, when do you think then someone going through divorce might need to hire someone like you to look at it? I know a lot of people think, well, my situation is very simple, like I'm confident in it, but then they're missing out on things like that. How complex does it need to be to hire a financial planner instead of just trusting the attorneys to know what they're doing for that specific part?
Well, and you just hit on the thing I was about to say, which is you said, trusting in the attorneys. If you don't have an attorney, stop, go get an attorney. Most people have never been divorced. Most people have never gone through divorce. And so the basic thing here is even if you and your spouse are like, well, we're going to be nice, we're going to be civil, we're going to get along, that's great. That's wonderful. Be nice, be civil, get along. Terrific. But the second it gets adversarial, then it's going to become a question of who has the best leverage, who is the best person who can make the best arguments. And part of what can sometimes happen here is that in our desire to be altruistic and not fight and not do any of that sort of stuff, we often make the mistake of assuming that our partner knows just as much or just as little as we do. They may know something we don't. They may have expertise we don't. Maybe they have a friend or have a colleague who has a lot of experience in this area who's telling them kind of the right moves to make or giving them the sorts of guidance. So it behooves you to hire a professional who does this full time for a living. And you can tell them, I don't want to fight. I want to keep this as conflict free as possible. And they will, if they're an ethical, family law attorney, they're going to do that with you. But you don't know what you don't know, and what you don't know can cost you quite a bit. And that then dovetails into your actual question, right? When should they hire somebody like us? Two reasons to hire somebody like us, or two big circumstances. Number one, your attorney has demonstrated that they're not good with math and numbers. And I bear in mind, I love attorneys. Like of all the other professions out there, attorneys are my favorite. No offense, teachers and engineers, you're wonderful, but I just find attorneys to be very fun. I found a lot of attorneys are not very good at math. And I don't say that to be mean. I say that to just explain that a lot of them can look at the face value of something like the $200,000 house, like the $200,000 401k, and sort of shrug and be like, those are equal numbers, next, and not really think about the tax ramifications or the compounding effects of those things in the future. On the other side of that, the second thing that I look at is something that you may not see in your attorney, but it's just a question of your circumstances. And the question here is, how asymmetrical are your finances? So if you were, let's say, both engineers who both worked for private companies, who both had 401k plans and regular salaries and regular benefits, and you both shared a house together, and you made relatively similar incomes, et cetera, you may not need somebody like a financial planner or a certified divorce financial analyst to help you carve that up, right? That may be symmetrical enough that we're not too worried about it. But let me give you an example that we even saw not too long ago. Essentially, one person worked in private industry, had a 401k. One person worked in the school district, had para, essentially. And their original thought was essentially to say, like, oh, well, I'll give you some of my 401k to buy out the kind of the share of the equity in the house, and then I'll keep the house, and then you'll keep your entire para, and you'll get some of the 401k. that is a grossly asymmetrical calculus because we haven't even begun to evaluate the actual future value of the para pension and benefit that's potentially available there. But also, we're now carving up a liquid portfolio, and we're now also trading off equity in a house and back to cost basis considerations, mortgage rate considerations, et cetera. I guarantee in that particular conversation, the asymmetry between how they were trying to quote unquote be nice with each other and divide things up together, the asymmetry was probably in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for them. And I'm going to bet, honestly, that one of them knew that and just wasn't saying anything, and the other one didn't know any better. And so that's a case where if you do not intimately understand your personal finances and the finances of your spouse or your ex in this particular context, you need to hire a professional who can look at it objectively and explain what a actually equitable division of your assets is.
Right. And you should each have your own then. You can't just as a couple hire a financial planner to give advice because of the adversarial aspect, right?
In an adversarial case, yes. You can now. There's a process called collaborative divorce, where essentially you have an attorney, you both have an attorney, you have a mediator, you both have a marriage counselor to sort of help there to help with like the emotions and the feelings, and then you also can have a certified divorce financial analyst who helps you equitably divide things up. And the trick with a collaborative divorce is that there's sort of a poison pill in it, which is if you start fighting, everybody's fired. So like the attorneys don't have a reason to start arguments, the planner doesn't have a reason to start arguments. Everybody's supposed to be trying to like make this happen together so that it all ends out well. But in those contexts, I mean, I'll give you a really good example of my first point about attorneys not understanding math. We recently saw a case where essentially one attorney was saying, hey, you need to give my client $50,000. And the opposing counsel is like, sure, we'll agree to that based on what's going on here. Looked at the client, said, great, we're going to go ahead and sign off on a thing that says you have to give them $50,000 out of your 401k, except it didn't actually say out of the 401k. It just said from that particular source. And that source then meant that the way that the court order that was written in conjunction with this, essentially that this person had to distribute $62,500 to give their spouse $50,000. We burned up $12,500 in unnecessary taxes because the person on the delivering side of this relationship, their legal counsel just sort of shrugged and said, yep, 50,000 is 50,000. I'm not really worried about where you get it from. And the receiving party's counsel is kind of shrugging and saying, I don't care where you get it from either, because my client's going to get $50,000 out of this. And it's not my job to point out that this is going to cost you $12,000 in extra taxes for no reason.
And there was a way to get around those taxes. I know what you're talking about. And it didn't need to be done that way. If the attorneys had known a little bit more about the process of it all, maybe.
Well, and again, just knowing the experience of the two attorneys in question, as far as one having like decades of experience and one being, no offense, sort of a baby attorney with only a year or two of experience, I'm going to bet the senior attorney knew exactly what it was going to cost. But it's not their job nor their prerogative to explain that or keep the opposing party from making that mistake. And in turn, the opposing party made the mistake because they didn't know any better or because they didn't have any care about it. Or, and this is something I don't like, I don't have the context to really make the accusation here, so I want to be careful in how I say this, but just generally speaking, some parties are just sort of indifferent. They're like, yep, if it's going to cost you money, it's going to cost you money. It's not my money, I don't care. And I don't love that, but like, I can definitely see a party just sort of being disinterested or checked out on sort of the ramifications of the advice they're giving. Not ideal, but it definitely could happen.
Sure. Well, I guess it just circles back to your point earlier that divorce is always a wealth destroying activity and sometimes in ways that you didn't anticipate.
Yeah, I mean, this couple is $12,500 poorer for no reason. And again, the divorce is the reason, but they just as easily could have said, if we do this differently, we won't cost ourselves $12,000 for no particularly good reason, and we can find a way to divvy that up, and we can both end up a little bit better for it.
Well, you live and you learn, I guess.
I mean, yeah, and at the end of the day, this is really, really where I'm going to come down on it. Good agreements make for good partnerships. So when you are getting together with your partner, when you're starting to get serious, we're moving in together, we're sharing expenses, whatever, have a thoughtful conversation about what makes sense at that time. when you're getting more serious, i.e. somebody's proposing, we're going to get married, have another serious, thoughtful conversation. After you're married, have another serious, thoughtful conversation. And as you're making career moves, you're making changes in your financial life, your earnings, your income, the risks you're taking, have these deliberate, thoughtful conversations with each other. Don't just do things unilaterally, because you don't know how it's going to affect your partner, and you may not have considered all the variables that go into that sort of decision. And if worse comes to worse and you have to go your separate ways, do everything in your power to preserve your wealth, but don't sell yourself short. Hire the appropriate legal counsel, hire the appropriate financial planner or certified divorce financial analyst to help you divide things up as needed, and try to get through that process educated, mindful, as uncombative as you can manage, and try to preserve your wealth as best you can in that process.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of wish I had done that. I think I'd be a little bit farther ahead in life if I had done that back when I got a divorce, but
you might be, and perhaps this is something you can share as sort of the takeaway, not so much of the last few weeks, but just as the takeaway. But, I think your particular case is a good example of sometimes there's just not enough to fight over.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there was mostly just that asset that was the business we owned together. And as I kind of touched on earlier, yeah, if we were going to divide it up, we would have basically destroyed it in that process. It would have been a very long process to sell, an individual business like that. We would have to keep working together for a year, day in and day out together while getting a divorce, and try to find a buyer and all these things that the business wasn't ready for because we weren't planning to sell it. So I think it just would have destroyed it in the process. And it was, okay, fine, I'll just, let the other person have it. So at least it lives on and I'll start over. And I actually financially, lost out, but I don't regret doing it because it was simpler and easier. And this place that I loved and put a lot of work into is still open and still functional. And I get a lot out of that, but I don't know that I'd advise other people to do it because it depends what their priorities are.
I think priorities are there, and I think just if there is a takeaway lesson there, and we've touched on it before, but the big thing is don't move forward until you have these agreements, right? Find that common ground, find something you can both work with. It'll probably be a compromise. It's not that often that people are just going to both come to the table and be like, you think this, I think this, great, we're both in perfect agreement. It's okay to have some disagreement. It's okay to work through it, but be cognizant that you don't want to speed ahead of these decisions and these conversations, because as we said up top, right, if you don't come to an agreement, there will be a system, and it's probably not a system either of you are happy with.
Yeah, we didn't get detailed enough. We each owned half, and we were like, surely that will be enough one day. If we have to divide it up, we'll each get half. But the actual mechanism of dividing it up didn't quite work that way, and we didn't think that through.
Well, and as I say, this goes back to the biblical thing, you can't split a baby.
Yeah, that's exactly what we were trying to do. And one of us ended up with the baby, but that's all right.
At least it's alive.
Yes, it is.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.